Okay. Good morning from Sacramento, California, and a wonderful afternoon to all of you at Oxford. My name is Katerina Lagos, and I'm a professor of history and director of the Hellenic Studies program at Sacramento State University. It gives me great pleasure to join you on this historic day, the anniversary of the Polytechnic Uprising that occurred in Athens 48 years ago. I'm especially pleased to be part of this panel as it reflects the close relationship between Sacramento State and St. Antony's College through our respective Greek programs. Today's discussion emerged from a conference held in Sacramento on April 21st, 2017, that examined the different aspects of the junta's domestic and international relations. November 17th is a significant day in the collective memory of the Greeks. The Polytechnic Uprising was a protest against a military dictatorship that had taken over power on April 21st, 1967. This military dictatorship, also known as the junta dictatorship, exploited the political turmoil of the 1960s in Greece to launch a coup d'etat and establish a dictatorship that lasted until July 23, 1974. The leadership of the regime was headed by Colonel Yorgos Papadopoulos, Brigadier General Stylianos Patakos, and Colonel Nikolaos Makarezos. Over the course of nearly 7 years, these military officers attempted to implement their reactionary social agenda while, quote-unquote, standing up to the United States and pursuing an independent foreign policy that supposedly served the interests of the Greeks. The colonel's lack of a coherent agenda and abuse of power quickly led to fissures within the leadership. By 1973, these fissures had turned into polarized camps of hardliners and softliners. The Polytechnic Uprising of November 17, 1973, shocked the world and exposed the barbarity of the regime. The international reaction led to an internal power struggle. Brigadier Dimitrios Ioannidis, who was one of the hardliners, succeeded in using the uprising as a justification for deposing Papadopoulos and Markezinis, both considered softliners. However, Ioannidis' tenure in power was short-lived. His attempts to overthrow Archbishop Makarios in Cyprus on July 15, 1974, and unify the island to Greece was a complete disaster. Turkey invaded the island on July 20th, and Cyprus today still reflects the division and trauma of the tragic events of that summer. Within days, the military dictatorship came to an end. Konstantinos Karamanlis was invited back to Greece and took swift measures to ensure that the military would never again threaten Greek democratic rule. The Polytechnic Uprising is celebrated throughout Greece as a national holiday supporting freedom and democracy. Students risked their lives to protest the regime, and to a large extent, they started the process for the downfall of the junta. Today's seminar commemorates this anniversary by discussing the junta's relationship with education, culture, the youth, and its legacy in contemporary Greece. These topics are part of a new book entitled The Greek Military Dictatorship, Revisiting a Troubled Past, 1967 to 1974. Our discussion today marks the first time we'll be presenting aspects of our newly released edited volume, which we believe is a significant addition to the wider literature on dictatorships, Cold War politics, and contemporary Greek history. For those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, there is a 50% discount code available on the Berghahn Books website that is still active as of 5 minutes ago. So without further ado, let me turn to our esteemed panelists, all of whom came to Sacramento during a sunny April weekend in 2017. Our first panelist is Othon Anastasakis, a dear colleague and friend, who is the director of the Southeast European Studies at Oxford, SEESOX, Senior Research Fellow at St. Antony's College, Associate at the Department of Politics and International Relations, Affiliate of the Center for International Studies, Affiliate of the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and former Director of the European Studies Center, St. Antony's College, Oxford. He teaches Southeast European politics and European integration for the OSGA and EU politics for the Department of Continuing Education. He is currently the principal investigator of 2 research projects, the Greek Diaspora Project at SEESOX and the Oxford BER-funded Migration Diplomacy and Turkey-EU Relations. He is also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, region head of Europe and Oxford Analytica, He received his BA in economics from the University of Athens, his MA in comparative politics and international relations from Columbia University in New York, and his PhD in comparative government for the London School of Economics. He holds additional degrees in French literature and politics from Paris 4, and Spanish literature, history, and history of art from the Universidad Internacional Menéndez Pelayo. Othon's chapter in the edited volume focuses on the educational policies of the dictatorship and is entitled Patient in a Caste: How the Greek Military Regime Traumatized Education. Our second panelist is Foteini Dimirouli, and she is the Outreach and Early Career Development Fellow in English at Keble College. She works on English and modern Greek literature, often in comparison. Her forthcoming monograph, Authorizing the Other, Oxford University Press, is concerned with the constitution of authorial fame and recognition. Her recent work focuses on culture and authoritarianism, with special attention paid to the appropriation of literature for both propagandistic and dissenting purposes. Foteini's chapter in the edited volume focuses on the appropriation and exploitation of the Greek poet C.P. Cavafy. The title of her chapter is Can Dead Poets Speak Back? C.P. Cavafy, Cold War Propaganda and the Greek Dictatorship. Our final panelist is Kostis Kornetis, who has already published a monograph on the dictatorship, as well as excellent work on memory and legacies. Kostis teaches contemporary history at the Autonomous University of Madrid. He has taught at Brown University, New York University, and the University of Sheffield. In addition to, he was the Connex Marie Curie Experienced Fellow at Carlos III Madrid and Santander Fellow in Iberian Studies at St. Antony's College. He is the author of Children of the Dictatorship, Student Resistance, Cultural Politics, and the Long 1960s in Greece, also published by Berghahn. He is co-editor of Consumption and Gender in Southern Europe since the long 1960s, and finally, Rethinking Democratization in Spain, Greece, and Portugal. He is currently writing a book on the generational memory of the transitions to democracy in Southern Europe, coming out by Oxford University Press. What a worthy panel. Othon, let us begin with you.
Thank you, Katerina, and it's a pleasure for the two of us, primarily for this book that came out in September, but also to share this with our contributors and our friends and audience. Just to say that after our three speeches, Katerina and I will be sort of co-chairing, because Katerina will be looking at the questions from the onliners that we would like to ask you to put on the question and answer box, and I will be monitoring the questions from here in the room. A truly hybrid event. With no further ado, let me then proceed with my presentation, which is about the approach of the military regime towards education during the period of the military junta. Now, the relationship between authoritarian regimes and education is by definition competitive, combative, and conflictual. And for autocratic rulers, education is always one of their core concerns, a source of potential opposition. As a conduit of liberal thinking, the youth, the students, and the academics, they have the potential to cause damage and become a basis of resistance and challenge to the autocratic authority of any dictatorial regime. For all autocratic rulers, education is a source of opposition as well as an opportunity. And here, one lens division between totalitarian and authoritarian regimes is relevant for our understanding of how regimes treat education and youth. According to Linz, totalitarian regimes are characterized by a monistic center of power, a more or less intellectually elaborate ideology, and an active mobilization through a single party, and where ideology holds a holistic conception of man and society. Fascist regime is a prime example during the interwar period, which sought a totalitarian control over education, and because they saw themselves as radical alternatives to the status quo, they sought to create youth movements with a long-term ideological appeal and a complete control of the content of information. Similarly, the communist regimes imposed their own educational culture under the totalitarian domination of the state and the one-party system, from the Soviet and East European variations to Mao's in China Little Red Book. Authoritarian systems are, on the other hand, systems with limited and controlled pluralism, more often than not without an elaborate and guiding ideology, and lacking the ability to create influential parties or youth movements. A second relevant distinction to my discussion when studying the ideational environment of autocracies is one between ideologies and mentalities. And according to Vauvel, the former, the ideological systems of thought, more or less intellectually elaborated and organized by intellectuals or pseudo-intellectuals themselves or with their assistants. The mentalities, on the other hand, are disparate ways of thinking and feeling, more emotional than rational, that provide non-codified ways of reacting to different situations. My presentation today and my chapter in the book argue that the Greek military rulers were a textbook case of an autocratic military dictatorship dealing with a sector it perceived as a primary threat. More concretely, they reversed the educational reforms which had been adopted in the previous parliamentary context, echoing the rigidity and reactionary nature of the military mind, and adopted all the standard methods to control education through propaganda, infiltration, and repression. Nevertheless, caught in the middle of a rapidly growing Greek economy, the military rulers were torn between their illiberal and repressive practices and an objective need to modernize the field of education. While modernization in advanced capitalist societies is the product of democratic education, in authoritarian regimes of limited or repressed pluralism, the need for modernization and economic liberalization comes into conflict with their propensity to control the scientific and intellectual debates. At the time of an increasing internationalization of education and information in the Western world of the 1960s and 70s, marked by the rapid spread of liberal ideas, the controversies and contradictions of the regime of the military junta became much more evident in the field of education. But let's look very briefly at some of the defining characteristics and moments of the junta's approach to education. First of all, the military mind, in that the 21st of April regime lacked an organized system of beliefs or a comprehensive authoritarian ideology in order to interpret its surrounding reality and in order to mobilize society around a convincing narrative. The ideological justifications of the military junta reflected the controversial and often personal military mentalities of the rulers, with some minimum common denominators around the notions of ultranationalism, Greco-Christianity, and anti-communism. The combination of these three led to the adoption of statements and policies typical of their ill-based intellectual skills and of their ideological confusion. The 21st of April regime's ideology was formed through the officers' own militaristic education, their powerful position in the post-World War II Greek state, their clientelistic connections with civilian elites, and the power attributed to them by US interference during the anti-communist Cold War environment. Greek officers believed that the army was the embodiment of national ideals, identity, and consciousness. Going to the second item, the reactionary nature of the system, one of the first and immediate policies of the military regime when it went into power was to reverse the changes that had been initiated by the 1964 educational reform to its pre-1964 status. And through an emergency law on the organization and administration of education, they completely and systematically demolished the previous democratic educational reform, which had been actually the most comprehensive and progressive reform in Greece's education history up to that time, and brought about the outright abrogation of most of the recent changes that had been proposed, including the return to 6-year compulsory education, school leaving age of 12 instead of 15 years old, abolition of the lyceum, the return to a system of exams, the reduction of the period of teachers' training, and the abolition of the baccalaureate. Last but not least, the military rulers had a fixation with the Katharevousa language, the purified Greek language, and used to call the Demotic, the popular language, as a semi-barbarian Turco-Hellenic language. In 1968, the junta's constitution declared Katharevousa as the official language of the state. In that sense, schools had to also teach pupils in this language. All textbooks, they had to be rewritten in this purified Greek. And teachers who were opposed to the use of the Katharevousa were immediately dismissed from their teaching posts. Most of the military rulers themselves employed the use of kathareusa in their speeches, their legal documents, their regime books, as a status of Greekness and in the spirit of Greco-Christianity, which combined with their often nonsensical context would invite the mockery if it was not for the severity of the regime's repression. The other item is skepticism towards the youth, and I believe Kostis is going to elaborate more on this, but according to one of the principal ideologues at the time, his name is George Georgalas, the younger generation, and especially the students who are unbearably bored, were considered persistent bearers of a revolting tendency influenced by well-fed intellectuals. The conversion of the international student movements from orthodox Marxism to more radical forms of revolutionary action, inspired by the examples of Mao, Castro, or Che Guevara, had persuaded Georgalas that by the early 1970s, communism has ceased to be the major threat, and anarchism had come to hold a greater attraction for young people. The regime's policy towards the youth informed the ideas such as the above, involved the immediate dissolution of all youth organizations, of all ideological persuasions from left to right. One of the initial acts of the military governors were the decision to censor a long list of printed publications. Upon their arrival, they forbade the circulation of 647 books by both Greek and foreign authors, 83 newspapers, and 44 periodicals. The list included even some unexpected entries, such as George Finlay's History of the Greek Revolution, or Constantine Paparigopoulos' History of the Greek Nation, the latter author considered to be the founder of modern Greek historiography and of the principle of Greek continuity from the antiquity to the present. Clientelism, estranged from their previous civilian political establishment and isolated from all mainstream intellectuals and pedagogues, the military rulers interfered in educational matters through the control of institutions and the use of clientelistic links, and relying on opportunistic supporters and loyal officers in crucial educational posts. The military government intervened in the elections of professors, either by refusing to appoint the choice of the competent electoral bodies or by making appointments without respecting the electoral procedures. They also obliged professors to sign declarations of loyalty to the regime. At the same time, there was a long list of professors, readers, and assistant staff who collaborated with the military junta, aiming at their personal professional ascendancy. Some of them offered their support to the regime's ideology and propaganda, with the publication of pro-governmental books and articles, laudatory speeches, and membership of pro-dictatorship associations. Others collaborated with the security police in passing on information on students and professors. Others accepted ministerial administrative appointments offered by the regime. The military regime governed in the midst of a growing economy marked by urbanization, rise of manufacturing sector and servicing industry, including tourism, and an economy that continued to increase until 1973 before being affected severely by the oil crisis. Apart from the fact that demand for education was constantly increasing, there was also a need to address the supply of a more technical education to reflect the needs of the changing economy. And already in 1971, the regime established a committee for the study of education to provide recommendations on how to improve Greece's technical education, adopted a law on technical and professional education, and by 1973, the military regime had established 5 vocational and professional training schools throughout Greece, and more resources and money that went into supporting special educational programs of this nature. In 1973, the regime attempted, in parallel to that, a pseudo-liberalization, which it tried to combine with the continuation of repression, control, and demobilization by allowing some controlled pluralism, which led eventually to the student resistance and revolt. The events at the law school in Athens in February 1973 are considered to be the prelude to the subsequent, more impactful Polytechnic Uprising in November 1973. There, the student grievances at first concentrated on internal matters such as democratic elections and free discussions regarding the educational curriculum, demanding democratic rights to be respected as members of the Greek university community, but then quickly expanded to include open demands for the fall of the military junta. The Polytechnic Uprising gained massive momentum and ended in bloodshed following the intervention of the police and the army, and the image of the tank crashing on the gate of the Polytechnic School has remained as one of the most powerful images in the nation's collective memory. The Polytechnic Student Uprising signaled the beginning of the end of the military regime. It put an abrupt end to the regime's attempted liberalization, and it brought about the immediate downfall of Papadopoulos' authority and his overthrow by the hardliner faction, as Katerina has already mentioned. But even during that hardline period that lasted for a few months, it was increasingly obvious that higher education had become the strongest pillar of resistance and presented the biggest challenge for the regime as the most serious source of opposition. And in an effort to address the causes of revolutionary student mobilization, the Ioannidis hardline regime organized a series of 9 ministerial councils between February 74 and June 74 on youth. Among the variety of opinions heard, some ministers tried to associate the student anti-dictatorial struggle with the revolutionary movements in Western Europe or the ills of consumerist society. Others blamed unemployment, others the decreasing influence of Greek Orthodox Church and the lack of ideals, as they called it. Subsequent propositions to reform higher education varied from the very reactionary and backward-looking options to the reformist and forward-looking. It is interesting to note that some of the views suggested during those meetings concerned the abolition of university chairs, student participation in the management of universities, evaluation of the professor's work every 7 years, introduction of Marxist philosophy in teaching, the official use of modern Greek language, or changes in technical education and infrastructure of university apparatus. The downfall of the military regime in July 74 marked a new beginning for Greek politics and society, was what came to be known the metapoliteracy, with concrete steps to move away from the dictatorial traumatic experiences and to redress some balance in a polarized post-authoritarian political and social process. Nowhere is this more visible than in the field of education, which went through a period of catharsis and lustration and reform, timidly at first by the right-wing government of New Democracy, but then more forcefully when the socialist PASOK came to power in 1981. The legacies of autocratic education of the years of the military regime are still with us today, and we can discuss this further. I'm sure that Kostis is going to address that also, but it's true that the Polytechnic annual anniversary is not just a commemoration of the atrocities and the heroic resistance of the students at the time, but also a yearly opportunity for mobilization and reaction to contemporary grievances. And that's all from me at the moment, Katerina.
Thank you very much, Othon. And now for our next panelist, Foteini Dimirouli, who will be speaking on Kavafi and her beautifully written chapter in our book.
Thank you, Katerina. So my chapter in this book and my work on the dictatorship is concerned specifically with culture, and not just the repressive variety of culture, but also what we call soft power, so sort of more subtle dynamics. My case study is Sifi Kavafi, but I think the specific case study is useful in terms of drawing more general conclusions about the way authoritarian regimes sometimes use works, poetry, whether it's poetry or literature more generally, to sort of further political causes and purposes. So when an authoritarian regime comes into power, it needs to tell its own story. This story has to become the dominant one. It also needs to be convincing in order to gain followers and collaborators and to buttress its power and ensure it remains to some extent unchallenged. The military dictatorship in Greece was established by coup and imposed as an intermediate stage to fix and correct political wrongdoings and tensions in the country. The story at the core of the dictatorship was not always unified, but broadly it goes thus. It was labeled a revolution with a name to keep communism at bay, set Greece on track toward development, heal the traumas of the past, and toward its end, as a necessary stage for an eventual return to democratic governance. Keeping a story intact and resonant means that no other stories emerge to undermine its legitimacy. Accordingly, the junta tried to silence voices of protest through the overt repressive tactics of censorship and persecution of intellectuals, artists, publishers, and the press. In a spree of political paranoia that is not uncommon in authoritarianism, the dictatorship saw threats and connections everywhere. For example, it blacklisted not just content that was evidently posited against the dictatorship, but also a wide range of literary texts that were deemed to promote dangerous ideas and could, at best, only be loosely interpreted as anti-dictatorship. So, for example, the first book index blacklisted Marxist texts and Russian literature, modern writers ranging from Yanis Ritsos and Vasilis Vassilikos in Greece to Jean-Paul Sartre, T.S. Eliot, and Albert Camus. Certain works of Aristotle, classical drama translated or staged by politically suspect personalities, as well as a number of studies by classical philologists and historians, for example, those touching on the topic of ancient Greek homosexuality. The regime was also notorious for its brutality. Intellectuals, writers, publishers, and artists were exiled, tortured, and shunned from public life. And the most famous examples are Theodorakis and Ritsos, a poet and a composer. Much has been written about the dictatorship's book bans and witch hunts, as well as the violence with which it controlled and suppressed what were perceived as potential counter-narratives to the dominant story. Less attention, however, has been paid to the ways in which the dictatorship sought to tell its own story, and not just through its own publications, public dissemination of ideas, but also through the reformation of the school curriculum, which Othon has mentioned, and what I'm interested in, the retelling of familiar stories in a new way. Rehashing old stories is a powerful method to infiltrate consciousness. The signifier is familiar, and all you need to do is control the signified. An example of this retelling were the publicly performed festivals of the military of the Greeks, which, as Gonda Van Steen shows in her book, Stage of Emergency, drew their symbolism from the classical past and from its entrenched popular currency. Similarly, Dr. Jessica Kougnakti, in her PhD thesis, The Classical Asset, surveys how the classical past became a valuable resource in the hands of the dictators, who manipulated it to further their own political ends. The refashioning of or allusion to the classical heritage under the dictatorship is then part of what we know as soft power, political propaganda in its subtle, more ideological variety. This variety of propaganda is less explicit, non-repressive, and functions at the level of the symbolic. Soft power was also a crucial part of the US crusade to suppress communist influence during the Cold War. And this is also connected to the Greek dictatorship, and I will address it in a second. But did the dictatorship use not only the classical past, but also modern works and symbols as a method to accrue legitimacy and to spread its political message? In the chapter I have contributed, I explore how the poet Sipi Kavafi became part of the dictatorship's propagandistic arsenal. And Sipi Kavafi is perhaps the most famous modern Greek poet. He was an Alexandrian poet, but he wrote in Greek. And today he's sort of symbolic of modern Greek literature at large because he has gained so much traction on a kind of global level. In the chapter, through Kavafi, I claim the junta sought to tell its own story. For example, through the manipulation of his poetry by Georgios Georgalas, whom Othon has also mentioned, in the dictatorial treatise, Ideology of the Revolution, and through the teaching of his poetry in a school curriculum heavy on classically inspired themes and intent on nurturing a military ethos. Kavafi was widely popular by the time the junta came into power in 1967. He was also conveniently dead, which means he could not defend his work, react, or express political opinion, unlike other popular writers, such as the Nobel Prize-winning George Seferis, who spoke against the junta publicly, not without pressure, as we found out later on. In his treatise, the Ideology of the Revolution, a revolution here being the dictatorship, the ex-communist, propagandist, and deputy prime minister Georgalas quotes two of Kavafi's most well-known poems, Walls and the Windows. And these poems, broadly speaking, position the first-person narrative in a state of stifling enclosure, occasioning desperation and dejection within walls or behind windows. And Georgalas picks and chooses from these works to craft an allegory for the dogmatic and delusional communist. who is trapped within a prison of his own making. Ironically, Georgalas also makes use of the final lines of The Windows, this is one of the two poems, which cautions against hoping for a better alternative. Opening a window, Cavafy writes, does not mean we will be free. We might be confronted with a different form of tyranny, and the poem does include the word tyranny. In Georgalas's hands, the poem becomes a part of a narrative of the dangerous communist, and by extension, celebratory of its counterpart, the savior dictator. In other words, of the junta story, as an ideologically driven revolutionary movement destined to protect Greece from a communist uprising. At this point, there might be some resistance to this notion from those of you who are familiar with Cavafy. Why would a pro-dictatorial treatise choose Cavafy? He was gay, he had written about being gay, and in any case, we cannot think of Cavafy without also thinking that he has been heralded as exemplary of unpatriotic, unpartisan, and anti-authoritarian politics. In my chapter, I explain how this worked. I go through a number of factors that enabled Cavafy's endorsement for the junta and that made it actually viable. Firstly, Cavafy's erotic or sensual poems about homosexual love were completely excluded from any pro-establishment use during the dictatorship. And let us not forget here that the colonels generally pretended that homosexuality didn't exist. Secondly, Cavafy's endorsement, the junta's endorsement of the Katerina played a role. Cavafy wrote in a mixture of Demotic Greek and Katerina, and that was different to other poets of the time who wrote in the Demotic Greek. Often I said that, and it's true that the junta was very partial towards the Katerina, and also the link between using the Demotic and being a communist was also very active during the time of the dictatorship. So that was another reason why pro-dictatorial ideologues were drawn to Cavafy. Thirdly, Cavafy promoted a wider idea of Hellenism, which included, for example, the Hellenistic period. Up to then, and especially during the Metaxas dictatorship, from which the junta was sort of different in some respects, the idea was that Greece was glorious during the classical times and during the Byzantine Empire. Now the dictatorship was trying to revive this idea of a continuum, and Cavafy very much was a poet of the Greek continuum, the Hellenic continuum. So that also fit the cause. And also Cavafy could plausibly be thought of as a poet favorably disposed towards Christianity. And the junta slogan, Greece of Christian Greeks, is vocal of the connection between Christianity and Hellenic identity. And lastly, Cavafy's existential aporia in his poetry, as well as the structuring of dichotomies between inside and outside, self and other, lend themselves to the projection of ideological dichotomies. Hijacking such poetic dichotomies to paint a black and white picture of the world does not happen exclusively, of course, within authoritarianism. In 1966, 1 year before the coup, the American journalist Cyrus Leo Sulzberger appealed to the perennial symbolic popularity of Cavafy's Waiting for the Barbarians to craft political content that overlapped with the junta's anti-communist discourse. That happened beyond the borders of Greece and within a democratic setting. Sulzberger, who has been accused of being a collaborator with the CIA, served as chief foreign correspondent of the New York Times between 1944 and 1954, and was also head of its foreign service. He followed a similar line to Georgalas in his appropriation of Cavafy in an op-ed about Greece in the Foreign Affairs column of the New York Times. In his piece, The Bourgeois Barbarians, Sulzberger, even more pointedly than Georgalas, divested Cavafy's poetry of its open-endedness to illustrate a condition of perpetual emergency under the communist threat. And it's actually quite an alarmist piece. It's interesting to see Cavafy's poetry used in that sort of context. I'm not going to go into details about how exactly the poetry is used, but I would say broadly, the idea is that whenever there is subtlety, because usually what Cavafy's poetry does is it introduces an irony that undermines whatever sort of impression one might have had early on in the poem, that sort of thing is flattened out a bit. So what remains is a dichotomy that somebody like Georgalas or Sulzberger takes advantage of to sort of project their own political view. So Georgalas and Sulzberger, different political contexts, different countries, yet using Cavafy's poetry to further the anti-communist cause in sort of an alarmist fashion. But Cavafy was also used at the very same time by the very opposite camp, for the purpose of dissent against the dictatorship in Greece. His work occupied center stage in 18 texts. This is a joint act of intellectual resistance against the dictatorship, published in 1970 by prominent Greek intellectuals and writers. It's one of the most famous books in Greece. Marounitis, an academic and a writer, was the author of an essay about Kavafis' poem Darius, which, among 17 other fictional, poetic, and essayistic works, shed light upon the country's dire state under the dictators. The collected volume is considered a milestone in anti-dictatorial discourse and has been monumentalized as the most subversive textual event in modern Greek history. It first circulated in 3,000 copies, which were sold out within days, leading to numerous reprintings and translations in different languages. In Marounitis' chapter, Kavafi becomes a proxy that allows the author to speak in a coded manner against the dictatorship and to address the burden of collective responsibility to react. All of this happens, of course, in a very coded way because there's still censorship applied. In this way, Kavafi also became part of the counter story that was meant to undermine the status quo. So in this chapter that I've written in this presentation, I have argued that the redeployment of shared cultural symbols and narratives is commonplace in propaganda. Relying on the past means that there is no need to craft new stories, but merely to tell old ones, familiar ones, in different ways. But does the method of this redeployment change according to the political cause? Scholars are more likely to speak of misappropriation or misreading, both sort of negatively inflected variations of appropriation in the case of authoritarian manipulations of poetry or literature generally. This is evidently because authoritarianism is distasteful to most of us. I hope all of us. But do the textual mechanics of narration differ according to the story one is telling? In my chapter, I conclude by thinking about whether the actual use of literature for politics at the level of the phrase is different according to what the politics are. Do dictators have a very specific and unique way of doing a disservice to literature? Or are they merely picking a meaning and rolling with it, not like anybody else would? I think this question is at the heart of comprehending how soft power works in the cases of literary appropriation and of remaining aware of its subtle mechanics across political contexts. And I'm sure that more work on the dictatorship and how it manipulated literature and poetry that was modern at the time would yield even more interesting results in that direction. Thank you. That's all.
Wonderful, thank you. And now for our final panelist, Kostis Kornetis, will be talking about youth, memory, and legacies for the period. So take it away, Kostis.
Thank you very much, Katerina. First of all, congratulations to my good friends and colleagues, Othon, Anastasakis, and Katerina Lagos, for putting together such a great volume, and to all contributors, of course. As Katerina said, this book was conceived in April 2017 during a 3-day conference at Sacramento, California. I was there too as a participant, and I hold very fond memories of that conference. So in a way, I feel I'm part of this endeavor as well, even though I couldn't regrettably contribute to the final book manuscript. Now, the volume is very timely, and it does provide an original synthesis of developments triggered by the dictatorship on various levels, several of which are really innovative, since it combines institutional approaches on the army, the university, and crucially the Greek church and the regime's economics. It also contextualizes Greece within a wider Cold War context. Several chapters deal with this, a comparative dimension that I find particularly valuable. I think it is important to argue against the exceptionalism of the Greek case under the dictatorship, and I'm all in favor of a periodization like the one, for example, proposed among others by Frederick Jameson, who coined the term high 60s for the period in question, or Arthur Marwick, who suggested the extended chronological period of the long 60s, and of course, Samuel Huntington's famous third wave of democratization, where Greece fits well alongside Portugal and Spain in the mid-70s. All these attempts at periodizing within a larger transnational framework bring Greece out of its supposed Sonderweg, suggesting that the junta unwittingly provided the complex and intricate terrain for the unfolding of what we could call the Greek 60s or the Greek long 60s. It was a period of late capitalism characterized by a parallel hardening of global authoritarianism with coups d'etats and military interventions throughout the global south, but also with a spectacular rise of anti-authoritarianism with social movements and a rise of counterculture. And here, the Greek case could and should be placed alongside global developments, including the 68 movements, the Third World Liberation movements, and so on. A fact that also explains this shared feeling among anti-junta movement members that the country's predicament of neocolonialism, US imperialism, as they saw it, was shared with countries as distant and disparate as Thailand or Chile or Vietnam. It also, this conceptualization and this periodization shows that the regime was much more porous than we'd like to believe, and that there were many contact zones with the outside world. But if I may focus on something that the conclusions hint at, well, actually, I think they stated bluntly, and which is at the core of my own research and interest. The conclusions state, I quote, legacies as individual and collective memories are important reference of the past, and they may be related to historical periods or historical moments. The November 1973 Polytechnic Uprising, according to the conclusion, is such a threshold moment that showed that the attempted liberalization by the junta was impossible and unacceptable. I think this is a fitting way of summarizing a very complex issue. It is a fact that the anti-dictatorship student movement and the Polytechnic Uprising of 1973 that we celebrate today did annul the controlled liberalization experiment promoted by the regime, thus saving the country from an authoritarianism with a democratic facade, with Papadopoulos as the president of the republic for the next 8 years or so. But the book also takes a bold stand on the recent revisionist attempts that tend to portray the Polytechnic as an unnecessary event that led in a linear way to great evils for Greek society, ranging from the Cyprus tragedy to a certain culture of lawlessness. A view, i.e., to blame the Polytechnic for all this, that strikes me as deterministic, linear, and ahistorical. In a way, in the past few years, the Polytechnic acting as a synecdoche, I would say, of the entire metapolitefsi that recently came under fire, or the Polytechnic generation, right? And this is a major volte-face from the early years of the metapolitefsi, during which the Polytechnic Uprising had inhabited a central symbolic space in Greek society, following the democratic consolidation. The actual process of memorialization of the Polytechnic legitimized the entire democratic transition, as evidenced by the fact that the first post-junta elections were scheduled precisely on the 17th of November, 1974. This specific date was thus appropriated and transformed into a national symbol, a national lieu de mémoire. It strikes me as dangerous that this national symbol and point of reference has been so viciously attacked in recent years. The other conclusion that the book draws, that the July 1974 moment of the breakdown of authoritarian rule, I quote, retained a dual conflicting significance in the subsequent intergenerational memory as a moment of national tragedy on the one hand, and a moment of celebration for the victory of democracy over the dictatorship on the other, as well as the start of a new epoch in Greek politics is also very acute. Two moments, as the book says, which in their own way brought about the discrediting and downfall of the regime, continued to be commemorated annually and often stir controversy. Now, this points at a major issue, that the Greek democracy, namely the Third Greek Republic, was built on the ashes of the Cyprus imbroglio. And once again, it is a great addition to the current volume, the fact that there is a separate chapter on Cyprus, you know, this huge elephant in the room, so to say, when we talk of the junta years. So this issue points at a very Greek phenomenon, which has taken up great proportions since the economic crisis kicked in, and definitely since Syriza's rise to power in 2015. A certain dichotomy between the two dates, 17th of November versus July 24. The Polytechnic versus the transition, or rather the transition from below on the one hand, a transition that never actually happened, but it might as well have happened, this line of argument says, in November of 73. I remind you of the slogan of the Greek Indignados in 2011, η junta δεν τελείωσε το 73. The junta did not end in 1973, but it should have ended in 1973, the implication is, versus the transition from above, on the other hand, or else the transition as we know it, with General Gizikis next to Karamanlis, a transition originated by the army itself, the institution that was the main culprit and responsible for 7 years of violent rule, and of course a major national disaster at the end. If we look at it on a comparative perspective, there is no other country that in its post-authoritarian politics retains two potentially competitive dates. And here I think of Portugal and Spain, for example. It is even more curious that the November celebration is infinitely more well known and celebrated or contested than the 24th of July. There is or was, I believe, a certain awkwardness about this, definitely in the first few celebrations of the 24th of July, precisely because it coincided with the Cypriot tragedy. How do you celebrate a day that also marks a tragedy for an entire people? It's a major conundrum. Here we should also add that the celebration was initially much less inclusive than it is now. Namely, until the mid-1980s, no representatives of the anti-junta resistance movement were invited to the presidential palace in late July, while nowadays I believe there is much more sensitivity towards that issue. But there still seems to be a peculiar and growing broad affair between the two dates and their signification. In the context of continuities and discontinuities with the past, a theme that is prevalent throughout the book, the 1974 moment became the signifier of real rupture with the illiberal past of Greece. This is another issue I would like to stress, the fact that the junta and its downfall marks the apex and also the end of the post-Civil War end of affairs. It is the end of what novelist Alexandros Kotsias used to call the Greek 30-year war. Other historians go even further back to say that it is the end of the schisms, the polarization and the fratricidal struggles that already started back in 1915. The events that follow were really watershed events. Karamanlis' swift legalization of the Communist Party, the withdrawal from the armed wing of NATO, the referendum on the issue of monarchy, the big issue that really troubled Greek society for many decades, right? The monarchy, the crown being an actual political player for so many years. So we have really watershed events and changes. But here I would like to stress that in the passage from the dictatorship to democracy, and again, thinking about social movements, there is something that runs parallel to political events. And that is society, the liberalization of the mores, which is often more advanced quicker, I would say, than institutional changes per se. New individual and collective behaviors, bred by a set of subversive everyday practices exercised by alternative anti-junta circles during the 7-year dictatorship, especially among students, changed the structure of feeling of large segments of Greek society. To connect it once again to the student movement, the growing presence of a significant number of female cadres and charismatic female leaders in the movement, a certain sexual emancipation and consciousness of parity are among the crucial elements regarding the outlook of what we schematically call the Polytechnic generation, which became a vehicle of change in the following years. As in most dictatorial regimes, private spaces served as the necessary springboard for an initial silent revolution that would ultimately lead to actual changes. Therefore, specific social and political practices that became a major source of pressure on the regime and to some extent defined its course, but also laid the foundations for a total reshaping of Greek political culture in the following decades. In this sense, I would like to argue against the pessimistic view of events, this idea that Greece got irreversibly contaminated by these 7 years. A major example is provided by the influential film critic Christos Vakalopoulos, who wrote in 1992, I quote, "Ever since the 21st of April 1967, Greek society abandoned itself and never returned." Also remember the signature publication from the mid-80s, Κάτι το ωραίον, arguing that the junta's kitsch transformed the country beyond recognition. Jessica Kourniaki, who Foteini referred to, has worked on these particular aspects of junta's aesthetics and their legacy. Not to talk of the idea shared by many that a variety of survivals due to an incomplete dejuntification or supposed incomplete dejuntification still plague the country up to the present day. Now, contrary to Vakalopoulos, I would argue that Greece did return, certainly altered, in some ways, certainly to the worse, thinking about the outlook of several Greek cities, for instance, so the wild touristic hotels, etc. Some affective legacies that are pointed at in the conclusions of the volume. But in many ways, as Othon said, it was a country determined to move away from some of the major ills of the past. In fact, Greek society entered the Metapolitef Sea a little bit more progressive and certainly more radicalized than before. All that above shows the need to explore and understand more and better these 7 years, which look very familiar and awfully close, and at the same time extremely distant and hard to approach. We need more research like the present volume, dissecting the particularities of both the regime and its afterlives, and moreover, more books that are audacious enough to combine various different approaches, ranging from cultural history, Foteini is a major example of this, to economic or hardcore political history, fields which are usually kept in strict separation. So once again, my warmest congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostis, for such a fitting conclusion and thematic kind of overview of our book. Thank you very much. So now we're going to turn to the Q&A. So for those of you who happen to be at St. Antony's, you may raise your hand and Othon will moderate the live discussion. For those of you joining Kostis and me online, if you would like to put your questions in the Q&A, I will be more than glad to read them out, intersperse them with a live question. So please use the Q&A function on your screen. So Othon, I'll turn the floor to you to take some of the live questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Katerina. And David Madden would like to ask a question.
Thank you very much. And congratulations to all of you. Very interesting. I have 3 questions. The first is for Katerina. You said the first thing that Karamanlis on returning in 1974 was to ensure that there wouldn't be any future military dictatorships. How did he do that? Secondly, and this is a quick question for Kostis, since you're sitting there comfortably in Madrid, do any particular parallels strike you between Franco and the junta? And the third question, a more general one, has there been any academic research on the genesis of the decision to get rid of Makarios? Because, I mean, whose idea was it? Who was consulted? Because anyone who knew anything about Cyprus history would have known that removing Makarios and replacing him with a Nayoka gunman would surely have a Turkish reaction.
Okay, so I'll take on the first one. So the military was prohibited from entering politics again. They were, as we put in our conclusion, put back into the barracks. And as Kostis was talking about the referendum of the monarchy, it actually brought, in my mind, this idea of the decapitation of the military. In my chapter, I talk about how the king and King Paul, I have a quote in there, what said to the military, to the army, I believe in 1962, I don't have my chapter, it goes, you belong to me and I belong to you. That the military had this direct relationship with the monarch, and the referendum served almost as a symbolic decapitation. So they were no longer allowed, no longer condoned from entering the political arena, and getting rid of their titular head, their symbolic head, also reinforced this notion. And for Cyprus, I'm sad that Yannis Sakas, who wrote the chapter on this, is not here to participate. But I think Othon or Foteini, anyone could answer that question.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for the questions. As far as the first question is concerned about Franco, well, you know, the quick answer is that we're talking about two very different kinds of regimes, not least because the chronologies are so different. So, you know, the Franco's regime in the 1960s and 1970s is an authoritarian dinosaur of sorts, whereas you know, the Greek regime you know, only starts in 1967. In a way, the Greek chronology, I think, fits better with the Latin American dictatorship, the Latin American model. You know, we have the Brazilian dictatorship, and then the Chilean dictatorship, and so on. What's interesting, though, about the Franco's regime is that because it lasted so long, it evolved and it changed. And I believe that the last phase of Franco's dictatorship, what is called in Spanish literature late Francoism or tardofranquismo, so the mid and late 60s and early 70s, I think it did share some elements with the Greek dictatorship. Is what it's often called in the literature, this kind of bureaucratic authoritarianism. So, as also Othon said, I think it's important to differentiate them from hardcore to, you know, totalitarian regimes at that point. An interesting common element is that both regimes in the late 60s and, well, early 70s rather, tried to liberalize from within, and the liberalization experiments failed miserably in both cases. So they didn't really manage to complete, let's say, the liberalization experiment as they had it in mind, mainly due to pressure from below. Of course, the transitions to democracy are very different. Franco dies. As we know, there is a pacted transition in Spain, and that's also an important difference from Greece. If I can add a final thing about Cyprus, there is a recent volume that came out in Greece by Alexis Papachelas, with, I think, you know, based on painstaking research on precisely the Ioannidis period. The Ioannidis period, he calls it the dark room, and it is a very unknown, dark period also in terms of studies on the Greek dictatorship. I think those months of Ioannidis are relatively under-researched and not very well known. But Papachelas shows that the coup d'etat against Makarios was, as we know, ill-planned, ill-conceived, and he quotes some of the, we can see some of the dialogues there of the commanders-in-chief and everything, and it's pretty surreal what's going on there. A complete lack of seriousness.
Okay, let me add some points to what Kostis and Katerina mentioned already by discussing what you, David, has put in your 3 questions, the 74 moment, basically, which, as Kostis very eloquently put, that kind of double nature, which Katerina and I also wrote in our conclusion, is how you have a successful transition to democracy on the ruins of Cyprus, basically, because the fate of Cyprus from then on was actually a divided island based on trauma and tragedy. And that dual significance is really something that, it doesn't allow us to say that kind of full celebration. On the one hand, you've got the celebration. On the other hand, you're trying to forget or, deal with the other event in a not so, open way. And that's why that part of your question on what happened with Makarios and Cyprus is something that is not allowed to be explored. It's a very uncomfortable kind of issue. But what I find is, as a comparativist myself in nature, is always to look at the transition of Greece in the context of Europe. There are major work done on this. Lots of people, Lawrence Whitehead, Nancy Bermeo, Othon, lots of people that have wrote about this, Nikiforos Diamandouros, and so on. What is interesting in that kind of comparison is that we've got 3 transitions which are different to each other. So we take the Portuguese example, which is there is an external environment, obviously the end of the empire of Portugal, but at the same time we've got a revolutionary moment there, and we've got actually the left-wing parties dominating. That is really revolutionary and spectacular. That's why for 2 years there was a big uncertainty in the Portuguese environment on how the transition was going to go. We know now that it went well, but imagine living in those times. Politicians had to take actually choices, in one or the other direction, and being under a left-wing government that was actually illegitimate before, during the dictatorship in Portugal, that was a major kind of development. In Spain, as Kostis said, it was a much more pacted kind of transition. There was much more agreement in how that was going to, to proceed. And there was obviously a center-right government there that took under its fold all those, delegitimized or extreme kind of elements coming from the Franco's dictatorship. That's why, Kostis knows that better, obviously living there, the Franco past is not something which is neither comfortable there in Spain in terms of really addressing it. And they took the conscious decision of keeping the extremists under the wing of the right-wing party in order to control them better. In Greece, it was a middle way in that there was a return of Karamanlis, who was in France at the time, and there was a continuity and a rupture in a sense. Obviously, the military regime delegitimizes itself by having that kind of defeat in Cyprus. But also the regime itself, the military junta, was divided because it was a junta of middle rank officers. They were the ones that were the rulers. The high rank officers, the generals, they got away lightly because they were not involved in that. So in that sense, we've got a part of the military that was clearly delegitimized. And what was even more important in the Greek case is that the military came under the politicians. That was a very spectacular kind of development and a real rupture with the past. Before, the clientelistic relationship did continue, but now the military was in need of the politicians in order to survive, which was the other way before. It was very much the other relationship before. So that is, I think, these are the elements that explain also how, Karamanlis did proceed in the first years with a smooth transition, but when PASOK got in power, it was this feeling that, with the right-wing government in Greece for the years from 74 until 1980, the past was not done with. There was still a continuity with that kind of right-wing political exclusion that existed before the junta. So by PASOK coming to power, it was a clear moment of more catharsis in 1981. That meant that you've got a much more consolidated transition and that your system can really handle a socialist party in power. I don't know if there are any questions from the onliners or other. Okay, let's go to the room. Yes, please identify yourself as well.
So my question is mainly addressed to Dr. Dimirouli. Thank you for your masterful contribution both to Gaddafi studies and the cultural politics of propaganda. So the Polytechnic narrative has become a shared story. It has become a signifier too. So is it also, in your opinion, redeployed by competing agendas of cultural politics? Or even has it become an arena of conflict? I have in mind the controversy, to say the least, concerning the events about last year's events, the commemoration, debate, etc. And my second question is, what's the role of reception studies today?
Oh, okay. Okay, so you were asking whether you think the uprising itself has become symbolic. Well, I think it is definitely symbolic in the sense of there is the argument that the dictatorship didn't fall because of the uprising. There were other political reasons, there were many factors that contributed to it. However, I think there is, in the national imaginary, it survives as the crucial moment where the dictatorship fell. In that sense, I think because of the youth participation and the sort of celebratory nature of it, and because we continue celebrating it every year, I think, and because the protests sometimes become quite inflamed in Athens, I think it definitely has broader cultural stakes. But were you asking about specific cultural stakes?
No, but what I mostly have in mind is the reworking of the signifier. For instance, we've all heard the phrase there were no deaths during the Polytechnic Uprising, or the refashioning of the narrative in order to fit into some more some liberal political agendas. And on the other hand, we have other cultural political agendas that claim this narrative as their own. So there are asymmetrical projections of the event, or maybe it's most appropriate to talk about calibrated projections, like a spectrum of projections on the narrative of the signifier.
Well, I think that how it's projected today has departed a bit from the historical event, because the Polytechnic Uprising becomes reenacted every year. And of course, we have the case of the Polytechnic School being shut, and of this idea that Polytechnic School itself has been sort of, that's the main discourse would be that it has become sort of a hub of criminality. So there's this discourse coming forward. So the Polytechnic School itself, I think, has also has renewed connotations these days. And the more events happen during the 17th of November, and the more sort of repression you have also from the police, I think that it becomes constantly resignified. And I think to some extent, it has departed from the context of the dictatorship itself to be very vocal of tensions today. So in this respect, I think it is a very evolving and continuous narrative. And I think the more tensions there are today amongst different groups, I think in reality, the tensions get played out on the occasion of the Polytechnic Uprising in a more symbolic way rather than just a literal sense of we need to, sort of remember the dictatorship. I think it does have a much broader connotation than that. Now, when it comes to your second question, what is the future of resection studies? In this specific context, you mean, or generally, or the political context?
So I was fascinated by the argument of tracing contesting agents, competing discourses. But what happens after mapping these tensions and these controversies? What's the role of reception studies in that?
So I think when it comes to reception studies specifically, and when we look at, so there is an argument to say that when you appropriate a text, you can do whatever you want with it. If I want to, I can cut, a quote, I can cut a verse or lines and kind of use them in whatever way I want. And the question is that legitimate? And what would potentially constitute a fair criticism for or against that practice, right? And I do think that close reading and textual analysis does provide an answer to that. And I do believe, and I'm a historicist and a contextualist, and yet I have found that when one looks specifically at literature and politics and propaganda, close reading and deciphering how politics are played out at the level of the phrase is extremely useful in deciphering intentions, in deciphering the function of texts. So I do believe that the future of reception studies in this context would be a keen awareness of contextual and historical issues, but also a return to more formal elements that will allow us to track how these mechanics work.
So we'll take another one from here or the questions there. Are there? Yes.
David Madden's third question. The third question, you asked the third question.
Genesis of the idea of getting rid of Macarius.
Has anybody, genesis of the idea of getting rid of Macarius?
I think we did address this in whatever way we could, because none of us is an expert here on Cyprus. Yes. Speak up so that the microphone can get your yes.
Okay. So my question is more about education reform and primarily primary and secondary education. So you mentioned the reforms that took place, basically kind of reversed the 17th reforms, and this kind of went back to the traditional values of Roman Christianity and the rest. And I just kind of wanted to ask whether you think that this was more a reversal back to the education of the late 40s and 50s, or whether there was an actual new trajectory in education policy, and whether that kind of marked a change from the 50s education policy as well, because looking back at the 50s policy in primary and secondary education, it was in itself very much centered on the traditional ideas, on the importance of family, it was quite sexist. So was it more just then a reversal of something that we already saw earlier in Greek policy, or was it a new kind of set that was specific to the junta?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And in fact, with Katerina, when we organized the conference and when we were thinking of the book themes, that notion of continuity and rupture was very much into our minds. In the sense that not everything that happened during the junta was a rupture with the previous past. There were many points of continuity that we can see in various sectors. There's a chapter in the economy, for instance, how the military regime continued exactly the same economic policy as the previous more democratic governments. In the field of education, the history of Greek education, or the education history of Greece, is a history of reforms and counter-reforms, meaning that since the 19th century, there was constantly that kind of push for modernization from the some sectors, of society and some daring political elites, and at the same time, reaction from the biggest majority. And that's why, especially in the 20th century, there's a series of reforms that then go back already from the 1920s. There was that push already, actually, at the beginning of the 20th century. The biggest protest would happen because of that language issue in Greece. So that really kind of brought people in the streets, the issue of education and the language. So in that sense, the 1964 moment is very important because it was overwhelmingly reformist in a way. It did bring all the necessary items of reform that were building up, and at the same time wanting to fight against the status quo, which was really solid there. So what the military regime did was actually bring back some of the things that were already happening. The edge in that was that it did bring its own kind of militaristic, but mentality, and some of those kind of almost ridiculous kind of touches in the educational policy. But in reality, it was bringing back some of the things that were already happening. And then again, in the 1970s, it itself had to go back to that kind of reference policy of 1964, because obviously what I said, the economy was moving on, and the society was also moving on. So to your question, no, they didn't invent something new. It's just that they took all the different, the past and the backward, and in their own kind of way, they made it even more ridiculous and reactionary.
Thank you.
Yes, Daniel.
Daniel Hardy, St. Antony's. I have a question for Othon. You say that many of the academics were co-opted by the regime, and then they expanded the more technical education, and also the economy went fairly well for much of the period. So why were the universities the center of opposition? Are you saying that university types are just intrinsically against dictatorships and autonomy, like people in this room, essentially just like that? Or do they see that they were lacking opportunities, or was the economy deteriorating? What is the big trigger? Why them rather than workers, or I don't know, anyone else you could think of in society, or professional classes?
In the Greek context, and also in many other contexts at the time, the 1960s, and Kostis has written brilliantly on those issues, on how the youth mobilized around issues of modernization and education. These economies were actually expanding. So education goes hand in hand with this kind of economic expansion. The thing is that the universities are by definition an area of opposition, obviously because they've got those, they want liberal thinking and intellectual debate. So those regimes know that this is going to be their most important enemy when they impose their regimes. This is something that we are seeing today. We're seeing this in Turkey. There are so many academics that actually have been purged from the Erdogan regime. We're seeing this in Hungary. The Central European University has similar kind of problems. So this is a kind of a standard practice. It's not something new there. What happened with the modernization of education and that more technical orientation was a pretty comfortable kind of area for the military regime to move in there, because that allowed itself to go into that technical education, which is something that is not politicized. When you need more vocational education, because you need to be able to accommodate the industries of your country that are actually booming. So it was also a way to, first of all, educate in a new kind of environment, more technical. That, it has to be said, went against its own kind of predispositions and a classicist education that was very, very dominant in Greece, but also their own kind of very limited thinking. But it did allow the military to the vocational turn to also do something with unemployment and to be able to channel the students of those kind of studies towards those areas. So there was some kind of complementarity in that vocational turn that they took in the 1970s with their own survival as well. It's just that they tried to have a pseudo-liberal as well image there, and that obviously backfired. I don't know whether Kostis would like to say something, additional to this.
Yeah, I would like to second what you said about the the university being the par excellence somehow of contestation. I think there is an additional sort of structural reason for this, and that is the so-called massification of universities since the mid-1960s that you hinted at, and this is something that continues during the dictatorship years. So we have a rising concentration, we have very high numbers. in a way that parallels developments in other countries of Western Europe. We have the student numbers doubling, tripling, quadrupling. So that's an important structural reason that really made universities hotbeds of contestation. I think there is an extra element here. Jürgen Habermas was saying that about countries of the periphery. We could add Greece, I guess, to that, even though it's a contested term and label. But he was saying that there is a certain feeling in the late 1960s and early 70s among students in countries of the periphery of belonging to a certain elite with also with a national mission. And I think there is a very strong element in people who oppose the regime from within the universities of precisely the fact that they were feeling very responsible for what was going on. They were feeling responsible. They had to react somehow as the future elite. The final thing that I want to say, and it's a response also to that element of many, or to that fact that many professors collaborated with the regime. I think it testifies to the symbolic weight of the student movement and the Polytechnic after the transition to democracy. The fact that the main institution that democratizes, that where the so-called dejuntification is carried out mostly, are the universities. And well, to some extent, the armed forces, but I think it took more time there. The rhythm there of dejuntification was much slower for obvious reasons. They couldn't take very drastic measures immediately. But in the university, we really have very radical measures, and the students partake in these sort of councils, giving documentation about professors who collaborated with the regime. This is an important element that I also wanted to add to what Othon was saying before about the different transitions, and that has to do with transitional justice. The fact that Greece is the only country where we have the main culprits being put in trial, but they were the only ones who were put in trial. I think there was a major decision to leave the entire bureaucratic mechanism of the regime somehow untouched. Probably it was a wise decision because it would take years to dejuntify. I'm thinking about mayors, general, secretaries, really minor figures, but figures of the regime nevertheless. So it is important that you have institutions which underwent this kind of dejuntification somehow from within, and the university is really, it really stands out in this.
Yes, Katerina.
We have a question online. Okay, so it is, I haven't read your book yet. I'm very interested in reading it, and well done for your efforts. As a person growing up in Greece in the post-dictatorship period, I have felt the power of what happened on the 17th of November, and I also lived to see the appropriation of its meaning by subsequent political establishments. Do all the speakers have any faith that the current generation of students or young people can ever relate to and be inspired by the ideals of the Polytechnic Uprising?
I can start by responding to this, but also wanted to have a conversation with Kostis on this topic, because while we spoke about the ambivalent nature and legacy of the 24th of July as a signifier of victory of democracy and defeat in Cyprus, There is also that kind of ambivalent legacy that Kostis alluded to it in his book, but maybe we need to expand a little bit on this. Given that the fact that while the Polytechnic Uprising was a heroic movement from the students, and that's something that nobody will deny, at the same time, it was also very much attached to an ideological bias of the left, in the sense that the left could much more appropriate that kind of legacy than the right-wing party. On the contrary, often, the left-wing parties would turn against the right, using the Polytechnic to their favor. So there is this ideological bias, and at the same time, there's also that kind of terrorist connection of November 17. So that's another thing that creates a baggage on that kind of anniversary. So that was actually a point that I wanted to discuss with Kostis, to see how you feel, Kostis, about that kind of ambivalent legacy of the November 17 as well. I mean, we all know that every year that the anniversary takes place, there's constantly the anticipation and expectation that there are going to be riots in Athens, which part of the political establishment doesn't like, and part of the political establishment adores. So it is a very divisive legacy, this one as well.
That's right. I think we really have to go back to the first commemorations of the Polytechnic. The first few years before it became a national celebration with PASOK. Actually, PASOK in 1981, one of the first things that it did, and this points to what you said. On the one hand, recognition of the contribution of the Polytechnic, but also an appropriation of the Polytechnic. But in the first few years, there is a very strong politicization of this commemoration. As Foteini said, by now, I mean, almost 50 years later, there is a certain reenactment of this. I think a reenactment of this past. The fact that this is when during the celebration and the demonstration, there is always a demonstration that ends up at the U.S. Embassy. In a way, is also a survival from of these years, right? So the element of reenactment is important here. Now, talking about the double-edged issue, and you mentioned the 17th of November. The 17th of November again is appropriating as a terrorist organization the symbolic baggage of that date. Koufondinas, actually the main gunman of that organization, he published a book some years ago called "Born on the 17th of November," right? Now, what's interesting is the popularity among certain segments of Greek society of the 17th of November in the first years of Metapolitevsi, that connects to transitional justice, and a feeling that was shared by some people in Greece, that the most notorious torturers, for example, they had received surprisingly low sentences. So I think the 17th of November really exploited that feeling as the Avengers, right? The first victims who were the stationer of CIA in Athens, Wells, and then Malios and Babalis, who were torturers. I think there wasn't. I think there were many people who saw these acts rather with sympathy. It says a lot, I think, about the political radicalization of those moments in Greece. Things changed later on, also in terms of the 17th of November in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. I think they became less and less popular. But what I would like to point at here is that members of the Polytechnic generation, also in my interviews with them, were very often very livid about the fact that this terrorist organization appropriated that name, that date, the entire signification. And some of them were telling me, people who were tortured during the dictatorship, that I've been tortured and I've never thought about killing my torturer, and more than that, I don't recognize that right to anyone, right? And especially these people, these avengers. So I think that's also an important thing, that from within the generation there is a critique. There is a critique to that. Having said that, however, I think there are some subterranean connections between people who participated in the first underground organizations against the dictatorship, in the first harshest, dark years of the dictatorship, where there was absolutely no political opportunities or space for the creation of a mass movement. People who put bombs and so on, and who were not content with the transition to democracy. I think there are several figures who flirted with, political violence and terrorism in the first years of democracy. But I think that's the minority, and it's definitely not the Polytechnic generation. Finally, about that question on the generations who came later, I think there is a major danger that was pointed out by Mimis Androulakis, who is a well-known member of the Polytechnic generation, student leader at the time, MP later on, writer right now, who published a book in the early 2000s called Vampires and Cannibals, I think. And he said, it's a very self-reflexive book about his generation. And he says that there is a great danger that the Polytechnic generation and all this myth about it, all this, aura about it, the great danger is that it might entrap future generations. That he said, my fear is that we're becoming like vampires, sucking the blood of future generations, because the social movements in Greece, all the student movements since 1973, they have to weigh against, one way or another, against the Polytechnic, and that's it's a major weight. It's quite difficult to deal with this kind of legacy.
No more questions from here. So, Katerina, would you like to close this?
I'll let you do that, Othon. So thank you from Sacramento. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to all the participants, both online and at present. And we look forward to more discussions about the book. And thank you for me. And Othon, if you want to say a few words to the audience.
Yeah, I'd also like to thank you very much for coming to this discussion on the Polytechnic. I think that obviously there is something very Greek about the Polytechnic Uprising, but at the same time, it's very, very relevant to so many other countries as well that have gone through dictatorships and have gone through those kind of moments of resistance. And, what it says about obviously how we remember all this. And as Kostis and Foteini and Katerina, these are never straightforward matters, and never looked, from the same perspective. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much all for being here, for your questions, and for our speakers as well. And we'll see at the next event. So goodbye from us.
Bye, thank you so much.
Bye.